Alright, continuing with our William Hurt retrospective, we're going to go to 1983, where we will talk about The Big Chill, which came out on September 28th, and Gorky Park, which came out on December 15th, which is represented today by the old VHS that I have of it. And this is still the only way I've ever seen it. So, we'll look into that, but first, I do want to talk about The Big Chill, since we're going more or less, in order of release. And what's interesting about this is not just the fact that he is reunited with Lawrence Kasdan after Body Heat, and will again in the last video of this little series that we're doing, but I don't know if this is, the way I exactly want to put this, but I did just find it interesting that with this movie being about a character that dies and people get together and talk about that person and the impact that they had, given what this whole William Hurt series is about, I kind of feel like there's no more appropriate context that we ended up talking about The Big Chill on this channel, so, which is essentially what we're doing here. Just the whole idea of this movie having all these characters come together, being driven by this unseen character, I actually think is one of the more powerful aspects of the movie, so it is very funny to think about one of the most probably widely known pieces of trivia from any movie, the fact that Kevin Costner was supposed to be Alex, and I guess he technically is Alex's dead body in the opening. I feel like it's kind of interesting they would even have Costner do that, but unless back in the cut of the movie where they actually showed his face, maybe we did see his face in the opening scene. I don't know, but yeah. But I actually do like the fact that I thought they were really smart when you read up on it, and they say that the reason that they cut Costner out of it wasn't necessarily that it was like, Costner's performance wasn't great or something. It was just the fact that Alex is so built up throughout this movie that there's not really going to be a scene that lives up to him as a person. So to just make him an unseen character throughout it makes perfect sense to me. And then going on as far as this opening with the funeral, more or less, once everybody has converged, if you've been unfortunate enough to have attended a lot of funerals, as I'm sure many of us have, it is interesting to see just the little details that this movie knows. It's like just things you'll notice. Like, I've always thought it was interesting that the funeral capacity seemed about right. Where it's like if you're in like this sort of big venue, it'll just be some scattered people in like the front few rows. I feel like I've only been to one funeral, I think, my friend's funeral in 2008, where it was like the room was so packed that people were standing in the back. When usually more often than not it is just kind of this sort of sporadic kind of feel. And I feel like the way the movie captures that was really just, like, the attention to detail to stuff like that was really interesting. And then the way that music can bring back the memory of a person, where we get this moment where obviously these, to just, bury the lead here, to not even mention the fact that obviously this movie has one of the most famous and beloved soundtracks of all time, but it's also the way the songs are utilized, where I feel like each song sets a mood to the point that it kind of feels like where it's not necessarily just them playing songs to play songs like a lot of big soundtracks do, but it's like the music feels like it's the movie's bloodstream, essentially, with the way like each scene is set up with a mood by a song being present, whether it already being on the audio or somebody choosing to play it in the middle of the scene. And in this particular case, where Karen, I believe, goes to play the song, You Can't Always Get What You Want during the funeral, and then the way that sort of transitions into the actual song is really well done. And then just the thing where she's playing the song, and it's just like everybody kind of starts to knowingly smile, where that could be the kind of thing where it either, it might make you break down, or it might just be this, it gives you just like a particular fond memory or something. And you can see kind of all of the fond memories sort of surfacing with these people, and they all probably have a different one, which you get that vibe that's really... I love how much you just kind of know, you feel like you know the characters before you even really know the characters, just because the situation can be so familiar to you. And also can't help but notice, it is funny that I made the comparison that we're talking about, gathering together to talk about a person who is no longer here. and how that ties into us doing a William Hurt series. It is kind of funny to me also in that context that Nick, played by Hurt, is the only one that's late to the funeral. And laughing at that is another thing I want to come to that I feel like this movie handles really well and really realistically, is the use of gallows humor between them. Plays a big part in this because there's some people that do it very loosely. There's the scene where Sarah makes an offhand remark of this kind of gallows humor, and then she like immediately scolds herself and hates herself for saying it. And it's like, when is it appropriate, when is it too far, and stuff like that. And it's like there's all varying degrees throughout. Like eventually, Sam starts to get sick of hearing it after Nick makes a comment, and it's the way that's handled. I think my favorite example of it is right there at the beginning when they're in the funeral procession, and it's I think it's Meg. It's talking about how like I feel so bad because the last time I saw him I yelled at him. And Hurt, just so deadpan, just says, yeah, that's probably why he killed himself. And it's, and it's like, stuff like that is really what sort of, like, where it might seem insensitive, it's like, you don't quite, I feel like, get it if you haven't quite been there, to where it's like, even if it seems insensitive, or maybe even the more insensitive it seems, if you can all laugh at something so dark, then that's actually only going to make this whole bond even stronger. There might be some people that don't appreciate it for sure. Or maybe one joke will land and then another joke will seem inappropriate, just depending on the context or where it's coming from. And just, like I said, the details like that about the real-life situation that these characters are in is where I feel like this movie really sort of, interestingly enough, comes to life. And how you can see like how there's seemingly more life to characters when they're in a situation like this, because everybody's sort of thinking about like it's not even something the movie goes into that much, but the idea that people are sort of thinking at funerals like, like what's mine going to be like, or what's it going to be like when I'm there, and it's like, is it going to be just any questions like that. And I like the fact that the movie doesn't really spend a lot of time asking these questions, because that would be the easy way to do this movie. Because a really easy thing this movie could have done that it barely touches on is the question of why Alex killed himself, which is never even revealed. Where it's like every now and then there might be somewhat of a small theory, but nobody ever really knows. And it's like there's only a really kind of a brief moment where they all get together and question, like the why in general. But even that doesn't really go much into much speculation, really. And so that essentially makes the movie this sort of feeling like you're kind of in this house. Like the way it's cut together, and we kind of cut in and out of interactions, it basically feels like this whole movie is you just sort of walking through the house, through the rooms with these people in it that and you're just kind of catching interactions in and out as it goes. And that's essentially what the whole feel of the movie is. And I feel like there's not a whole lot to analyze, which is really funny and surely intentional when we get the scene where they come down and Hurt is watching TV, and he's just watching some random gangster movie or something, and he says, you're so analytical, just let art flow through you. And I feel like that's essentially not much else you can do with this movie apart from that. So it almost kind of seems to explain itself in this line from Hurt himself. And I also love the moment in that scene when he says, to kind of just talk about the, not how it just isn't always a need for a particular plot or a particular purpose, if you're just going on feel. The moment in this scene when he's trying to decipher what's going on in this movie, and he says, I think the guy in the hat did something terrible. I think that's what's going on. And then when we cut to the screen, it's like all guys in hats. Just like every character's wearing a hat. And I love that. And I guess going on Hurt also, just these individual moments where we talk about, just these lines that are delivered. Like there's where the dialogue feels really real when you're just kind of watching all of them interact and talk to each other. And there's the scene where Hurt is like interviewing himself, which is great. But what's interesting about how real the dialogue feels between these people is that there's also, like, I feel like there's more one-liners in this movie than there are in most comedies, which is something that you wouldn't typically find in sort of dialogue that feels realistic. But it's like somehow the way they blend, like, one-liners that you'd find in just any comedy, and then the dialogue that feels like real people talking, and it sometimes overlaps, especially these scenes we get where it seems like these rare moments we get where they all kind of end up in the same room at once, whether it be a dinner scene or the scene where they're cleaning up afterwards, or they're in the like this den and they're talking about whatever comes up, and there's this sort of sense of comfort between everybody, where it's like even though Harold is married to Sarah, like he'll just come in and casually put his feet in Meg's lap, and then Meg starts to like massage him, but there's nothing that seems weird about this. Like it feels like this is exactly how they were before, and that's pretty much confirmed when Sarah herself comes into the room and just stops and says like, "Oh, this whole scene is just so familiar to me. Like this is exactly the way it was before and before everything else." And it's like when everybody was with whoever, and yeah, there's just something there's like a comfort in that, not just them in general with each other, but us as an audience watching them, where that comfort kind of comes through the screen and we can feel it ourselves. Like I said, so there's this constant vibe that you're just kind of there within them, and like even though we're kind of getting snippets of these people in their past, it still feels like they feel so lived in that we feel like we know them really just as well, when we don't really know that much until things are revealed as it goes on. We get little clues, like subtle clues, as they're each introduced in the opening credits scene. But like I said, really just things kind of keep getting revealed, because a lot of things are kind of cryptic for a while also. Where it's like, where clearly something kind of went on between Sarah and Alex, but then there's the thing where it's the way they portray. Another thing that feels so real about this movie is how complicated the feelings are, where like Harold gets up at the funeral and he's the one to speak, and then ultimately breaks down, and he's essentially doing a eulogy of his own. So you would never suspect that this is the guy that got cheated on by Sarah with Alex, the person he's talking about and breaking down over. And so you get that sense where it's like there's a lot of stuff like that that's put up, where adultery in general is treated very casually throughout this movie. But what's really interesting that shows the closeness of these characters is that you'll notice when they talk about complicated feelings or betrayals that happened or whatever, they talk about hurting, and like that those things hurt, and like you hear the term like hurt and hurting a lot more than you hear anything about anger. Like everything is so sort of chill about these people, and the way that they sort of let their emotions happen towards each other, that when we do get towards the end and they start fighting and we do finally see anger start to happen, there's such a discomfort to it, because it does feel like you're watching people you've known your whole life and have gotten along with your whole life are starting to not get along with each other when certain things come up, and like the tension in the room is real. Like you actually just want to get up and leave the room until it's over. It's so well done and so real amongst the cast. I've always wondered, like, when you hear about the trainings they go through and how close they get to, I've always wondered if you asked Tom Berenger who he felt closest to between the Big Chill cast and the Platoon cast. I wonder what his answer would be. I would mostly say maybe this, since he was playing a bad guy in Platoon, but that's still a question I'd kind of like to know. Because the closest here feels like so... I said you would think these people had known each other forever, where like there's not even close to a performance that's out of place or feels like it doesn't gel with everybody else. Like everybody feels like they were so carefully cast. That if like there was one person out of place or one screw that wasn't quite turning here, I feel like it would kind of throw the whole thing off. So the fact that the movie works as well as it does is clear that this is a very well-oiled machine when it came to the writing and the casting, and then ultimately how we see it all play out. And it's like even the way they like roast each other more like lightly. Like when they're watching JT Lancer and they're roasting Sam Ford and stuff like that. It all feels like everything's coming from a place of love. And there's even, there's the moment where the kid comes in and asks Sam for an autograph, and that he'd give him $1 for it. And I'm pretty sure that's Jake Kasdan, Lawrence Kasdan's son, who would actually go on to be a director in his own right, and I think actually has a new movie in the works like right now. So that's just an interesting thing to throw out there in general. But, yeah, so I guess at the end of the day, what this movie seems to accomplish the most, apart from bringing all these people together and making it feel so real, and accomplishing a great soundtrack that feels like, it's the movie's heartbeat. And then there's the way they portray the funeral really accurately, and how we feel about these people that we have really complicated feelings towards, and maybe some stuff that's really deep-seated about, and how it's going to come out when it does. The thing also that the movie just accomplishes, as far as it not needing to be that analyzed and just kind of letting the art flow through you, like Nick says, is its portrayal of people getting together, having really strong feelings in the moment, having really strong revelations, maybe even, sleeping together at some point. People who are married and maybe, sleeping with somebody else, and it may be a secret, it may be in the wide open, and it's like there's just a constant understanding here. But then no matter how close this is, and how it will probably always be that way, the more they come back together, once they go their separate ways, your lives just kind of take back over again. And it's like it's kind of that case of where some people do stay behind, like when Nick and Chloe decide to stay behind. But a lot of it kind of feels like it has that feeling of when you get together with somebody you haven't seen in forever and you say, oh, we're going to keep in contact, we're definitely going to do this regularly, and then you just kind of don't, and it's never intentional, and it's never like, just saying things to say pleasantries. Like, in the moment, you truly believe, oh yeah, let's do this more often, we're going to make this last forever. But then, like, the second you go back and then, like, life comes back, then it's just like... then it's just this blind path that you're just going blind on all sides except forward, and then that's basically what it is. And I feel like the way this movie feels like it just sort of kind of fades in and then fades out, and it's like there's not really a whole lot that goes on as far as, like, I can see people not liking this movie because it feels like it may not have a particular point or a particular conclusion. Or it does, like, individual characters do get little conclusions here and there. Like, there's a particular arc between, what Sarah had with Alex, and then Harold being the one that's chosen to, potentially father a baby from Meg. Like, there's an arc there, but for the most part, it does feel like they show up, things happen, and then they leave, and that's pretty much it, because that's pretty much what life is, and that seems to be what the movie's sort of main purpose is, and its main purpose to portray. So I've always really appreciated it for that, and like I said, it would not have come together the way that it did without the perfect cast that it has, and the way that they went together. So I think on that, we can switch over to Gorky Park, which is significantly different, which is really great about doing this Hurt series, because you can say that about pretty much every movie we're going to talk about. It's just more significantly different than the last. And so this one is based on a book, and apparently the character that Hurt plays, Ranko, has there's 9 of these with him in them, which I didn't know till recently, and I could totally be mistaken. I want to say this is the only one that's a movie up to this point, which is quite surprising. But going into that, yes, now we're doing a procedural mystery of sorts, where we do start with a group. What's really interesting about the way this starts is I love the introduction, where the opening credits happen while we're seeing people skating, and it's everybody having fun, and there's music playing, and it's this whole, just nice atmosphere, this fun atmosphere, and then the way it just sinisterly fades out and then fades in on the 3 graves, and then we realize quickly throughout this scene how gruesome this crime scene is, and it's like just the general juxtaposition of that is a really good way to start this and kind of show the dire nature of what it is that Ranko's going to be dealing with as far as this case goes, and the darkness of it. And yeah, so this is a story in general, both the book and the movie, that really highlight being, like, you see all these crime shows and how much they take off and how popular they are and how many of them there are, how they all have spin-offs or whatever, and how people are just really taken by the idea of the procedural, of seeing cops working on a crime scene and figuring it out. And it's like the idea that there is that sort of mystery to it, where it's like, you can look at like Agatha Christie stuff and murder mysteries like that, and that's typically given the whodunit label, where it's like you're trying to figure out a mystery yourself as it goes along and try to decide which of the characters in it is the culprit. And it's like, I feel like there's always an element of that in the procedural, like a mystery element, and the whoever it is at the end of the tunnel that's committing these crimes is probably somebody that we've been meeting throughout the story. So I always feel like that's kind of an unsung aspect to why procedurals are such a big deal, just in pop culture in general. And like I said, this story really highlights the idea of blending the procedural with a mystery really well. So it doesn't quite capture the book's feeling of like you like actually being there in the moment for like every little thing. But then again, like any book to movie adaptation isn't going to quite capture that. But I just want to make sure to praise the book also for really putting you right there. But as far as our main character, Rango, who is played by Hurt, what I really love about this character that's so interesting is that, by all accounts, he shouldn't be that interesting. But there's just something about the way, and the way Hurt plays him probably has a lot to do with this as well, apart from how he's written in the book. But he's a guy that's not really going out of his way to be likable. But at the same time, he is essentially a good guy amidst a lot of corruption that's going on. And it's like the way, seeing as how he's going to approach this case and how his tactics, the tactics he'll use to sort of go around this corruption that's consuming everything else around him, and the way that he's sort of being pushed to sort of start, in a sense, breaking these rules as much as he can to get, interestingly enough, to get around the corruption that's otherwise stopping him from getting to the bottom of what's ever happened here. And the strength in which he plays that, where he has that sort of, he's that kind of character, we kind of talked about this with Body Heat, where he kind of has this sort of cold, almost sort of arrogant nature to him. But at the same time, it feels like there's something so human about him, I guess you could say, that's like always coming through in his performances, where it's like he could be playing one of the most off-putting characters ever, but there'll just be this sort of humanity that's always seeping through that he's able to pull off. And I think that's what's really making this character, he's like an easy person to sort of hang on to and see where they're going to go, even if it's not exactly somebody that doesn't exactly scream like, I'm a likable character and you want to see me succeed and stuff like that. He just kind of gets you there organically, without having to really try at all, which is really great. And now that we've set him up as the main character, one of the strongest aspects of this story is the very interesting array of supporting characters and the supporting cast, essentially, where we have Lee Marvin, who is the American businessman. He's got this sort of, we know the character is going to be this really big, intimidating deal because it's Lee Marvin, which is great. It's not one of those cases where you're so glad that they got him for a part like this. It sounds like one of those cases where it's like, the casting would have gone after him, but they couldn't quite score him, so they had to go with the second choice. But no, it's the fact that it actually is Lee Marvin is amazing, and the way that he has this sort of, he can very much come in and have this very businessman-like quality to him, but at the same time has this really cold-blooded nature to him that's coming through. And then we have Brian Dennehy, who's this sort of beast-like dude that comes in that has his own sort of agenda going into it. And then kind of seeing them play off each other as it goes, and how completely different they are as characters, but how interesting it is to see them play off each other because of that. Ian McDiarmid is in this in a very interesting role, where he is an anthropologist who is tasked with sort of reconstructing the faces of one of the murder victims here, because the murder victims have been completely mutilated and their faces have been cut off, and he's an anthropologist who is putting their faces sort of back together, like using, not their actual faces, but reconstructing their faces for the sake of identifying them, and he is eerily into his job. So I feel like he's also perfectly cast and having a great time with this, despite just having this very small supporting role, but that's what makes a lot of these movies so golden, is these supporting characters that just really stand out. And Richard Griffith is in there, and like I said, there's all the potentially corrupt cops and all that stuff. There's a potential witness at one point. There's a great interrogation scene that kind of gets out of control. And that's the thing, is like the fact that it's unpredictable as to what kind of character you're going to run into next is what makes it really interesting, when you have all this, assorted array, and you're not quite sure which direction each character's going to go. Like when we meet Dennehy, we're not quite sure like if he's trustworthy or not. At first we think he might very well be a villain rather than an ally, and then the way that's revealed, and the way more is revealed about Osborne, the businessman, as it goes on. I love the cold-bloodedness at the end, when we realize that Brian Denny has been killed, and Lee Marvin's perfect delivery of, he killed my dogs, I gutted him because he killed my dogs. And it's like you're never quite see lines like that coming, especially when you're not sure which character they're going to come from. As far as our other person that gets wrapped up in this, who knew one of the victims and might know more as it goes on, the woman played by Joanna Pacula, and it's the idea of, she does have this vulnerability to her that I do think is appealing. It was like her first movie, but I don't know. There's something about where it feels like when they start to have an attraction towards each other, her and Ranko, it does feel more like it's a genre trope coming into play than anything else, which is kind of disappointing because one of the biggest strengths of William Hurt's whole career, when you look at it, especially the stretch in the 80s we're talking about, was his chemistry with his female co-stars. Where, like, that was, like, one thing where he always just had it completely on point, and whoever it was across from him, there was just this instant chemistry that was on fire throughout the whole movie. And I feel like this is one instance where that doesn't quite get there, and I don't know if it's the actress and her just not having maybe the experience yet, especially with somebody that was already, on top of his game, is still early in his career, but was this much on top of his game as he was. But, and like I said, when you look at that, it just kind of feels like a trope of the genre more than it, serving too much of a purpose or there being any real chemistry there. Which might be, like, one of the weaker points of the movie, but that's there's plenty of other, high points that aren't brought down by that. Where it's like, it does have a good pace, where it does seem like, just in general, this isn't really a Gorky Park problem as much as it is just kind of a procedural problem, which is sometimes it can feel like the story is just kind of going in circles a little bit, and when we get stuck in the investigation a little bit, then the story kind of gets stuck in a little bit. But that's the joy of bringing in all the different characters, where it still kind of feels like there's something going on, even if it kind of feels like the story itself and the investigation itself isn't quite moving along as fast as it could be. Where it's like, and you could say, oh, that just feels like an investigation in real time because it's not going to be that clean cut, in real life or something. And it's like, I feel like that's more what books are for, rather than movies. Where, like, in a book, I can understand us seeing every single solitary detail, including the mundane stuff, because books can still bring that to life in an interesting way, because it's still working with your imagination, and the way, just, constantly having you have to imagine the scenario is why even some mundane things can be brought to life so well in books. Whereas in a movie, it's constantly doing the interpreting for you, as far as visually at least, and the way it's telling the story. But even so, we do have a very unconventional score that's keeping things alive. Very unique atmosphere. I've talked endlessly about how much I love a snowy setting. And despite the way things are now, you can acknowledge within the context of the movie, Russia makes a very sort of unique and interesting setting. When you're used to, like, other, more typical procedurals. But at the end of the day, it does feel like, especially with movies like this, where that atmosphere, it kind of is more what it's about. Like, it's more about the feel than the climax. Which is honestly kind of what we talked about with the Big Chill just now. And it's like, when you look at it, when you just look at the cast, if you just look at the cover of this VHS, it's like, you can tell who's going to be behind this. You can tell who the villain is, and you can tell who the villain is pretty quickly, whether you're reading, the book or watching the movie or whatever. But once again, it's not really about that. Well, it does come to a satisfying conclusion, and there's also a decent shootout. It does feel like it's definitely more about that feel as we went through the process and we went through the investigation and we met all the interesting characters. That even if it does have, an underwhelming climax, it doesn't really matter that much, as long as we sort of felt that along the way. And we had the suspense and the intrigue there along the way, and the mystery to it. Like I said, even if, you know what's going to be at the end of a mystery, that, while it does sound like it for sure, that doesn't entirely ruin a mystery or a story. And I said, if anything, you can go back and see, some stuff where pieces were coming together that you didn't realize were coming together before. That's the beauty of mysteries also. So I feel like the movie pretty much covers that. Though I probably would recommend the book more, but once again, how many movies can you not say that about? So, I guess that's where I can leave this. So the next thing we're going to talk about is Heard's Oscar win with Kiss of the Spider Woman, and obviously we're going to have verses in between and more of the usual stuff. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it.